Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, I'm going to look at what I feel is the greatest underground album of the 1980s, Zen Arcade by Hüsker Dü. I remember hanging out with a few friends when I was around 18 and we were just cruising around in the car. The driver of the car was somebody I knew from school. I wasn't really close friends with him, but he was playing something unique. Out of the speakers came this cacophony of lo-fi sound that I assume was just maybe a hardcore punk from the early 80s. However, then there were songs with melody. There were these incredibly tripped-out noisy jams, there were some acoustic numbers, and even piano interludes. This music kept me constantly guessing, and I was very intrigued, so I asked what band and album this was, and I was told it was Zen Arcade by Hüsker Dü. By the time Zen Arcade was released in July of 1984, Hüsker Dü were well established in the underground hardcore punk scene. Based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, Hüsker Dü was formed in 1979, and the members were Bob Mould on guitar and vocals, Grant Hart on drums and vocals, and Greg Norton on bass. The name came from a Danish or Norwegian game, which translates to Do You Remember? The band would gain a reputation for playing breakneck speed hardcore punk, and this sound was captured on their debut album, Land Speed Record, which was released in 1982. Now, the album was actually a live album, and the album sounds just like the title. I'm talking rippin', fast galloping hardcore punk. Their first studio album, Everything Falls Apart, continued in the same vein, and they even have a hardcore punk version of Sunshine Superman by Donovan. There is a microscopic bit of melody here, but this album is pretty much hardcore punk played at warp speed. Where the melody started to be more prevalent was in the single In a Free Land, which was released in 1982. This song is very much hardcore punk, but there's this great call and response between the twin vocals of Mould and Hart with a very clear kind of melodic chorus. Now, this melodic approach would become more prevalent on the EP Metal Circus, which came out on SST Records in 1983. Now, there's still a lot of hardcore punk here, but there were songs like Real World and First of the Last Calls, where Mould integrates melodic choruses into his kind of rough vocal approach. But it would be two songs sung by drummer Grant Hart, where a much more poppier approach was taken. The most poppy sounding was It's Not Funny Anymore, which really sounds like a precursor to college rock, things like REM. But the track Diane is really good. It's a dark, melodic, post-punk sounding track, and it was actually written from the perspective of a serial killer. Now, this track would end up being in regular rotation at college rock radio stations and put Hüsker Dü on the map. Now, Zen Arcade would take all of this musical aspiration to the next level. When being interviewed in 1983 by Steve Albini, Bob Mould stated that their next work would attempt to extend beyond the realms of what people think punk rock or rock and roll was capable of. During their relentless touring, they would often try new material at their live shows. And the thing is, both Mould and Hart were prolific songwriters, and they were actually in quite a bit of competition with each other. And they rehearsed a lot of this new material they were coming up with in the summer of 1983 at this former church in St. Paul's. Hart indulged in LSD and Mould indulged in speed. They would jam for hours, and again, they're composing numerous songs here. They would take all this new material to the Total Access recording studio in Redondo Beach, California. They recorded with the SST producer Spot and ended up recording 25 tracks, 23 songs, with 21 of those being done in one take. 40 hours to record, 40 hours to mix, and the total cost was $3,200. But what was created was a visionary album that completely overturned the narrow confines of the hardcore punk genre. David Fricke of Rolling Stone, he describes it as a thrash quadrophenia. And that might be an apt description, because the album is, it's a concept album. It's based on the narrative of a young man who comes from a home full of conflict and emotional friction, which prompts him to run away from home. When he's out there, he goes through a variety of adventures, including joining the army, joining a cult, falling in love, having a girlfriend overdose on drugs, and eventually returning home and accepting his situation. But in fact, the whole thing might have just been a hallucinatory daydream. Conceptually, this is kind of prog rocky. You can compare this to albums like Genesis' The Land Lies Down on Broadway. But this album has a lot of buzzsaw hardcore punk. But then again, that's not the whole story. There are also acoustic numbers, plenty of songs with pop melody, completely psychedelic noisy jams, and even piano interludes. And all of this was recorded with a lo-fi production that gives this album its essential quality. Let's go through the tracks in more detail. The album starts out with the thunderous, something I learned today. It starts with a drum beat, you got 4 notes of bass riff, and then Bob Mould's guitar. It arrives and sounds quite like a swarm of bees. The melody of the song descends into full throat screams. You can directly hear that rough vocal style that Kurt Cobain would use later. This is a precursor to that. In fact, the whole album definitely had an influence on the Seattle Trio. It immediately goes to the next track, Broken Home, Broken Heart, which continues with that hardcore punk ferocity. The song describes an emotionally turbulent home, and Mould screams, "Your parents fight, you don't know who's wrong or right, have to cry yourself to sleep at night." Now, this sound is a complete contrast to how Grant Hart deals with the same theme on the next track, Never Talking to You Again. Hart's vocals are accompanied by an acoustic guitar as he details the emotionally isolated household of the protagonist. Right here, we have the format of hardcore punk being directly challenged by inserting this acoustic track. There are things that I'd like to say, but I'm never talking to you again. That is followed by an absolutely dynamic song called Charter Trips. It starts out with this amazing descending riff. It actually reminds me of the rock band Rush. The song inserts pop melody here though, but it's through Bob Mould's rough vocal style. But it does hint at where Hüsker Dü would further develop their sound. And this song describes the main character leaving home, and he ends up actually joining the army. Now this song is followed by a tripped out psychedelic instrumental called Dreams Reoccurring, which it sounds like they're using some kind of backward tape loop. It's really, really wild stuff. You gotta remember, Hüsker Dü was very influenced by bands like the Byrds. Then we are back to a fierce hardcore punk song called Indecision Time. And then you've got another tripped out jam called Hare Krishna. Now this, of course, represents the protagonist joining a cult. Now if you like noisy, rhythmic, psychedelic sounds, you'll definitely dig that track. But then we have a quartet of just slamming hardcore punk songs. 4 of them. The first of these is Beyond the Threshold. It's so intense, but it's almost psychedelic in a weird way. And that's immediately followed by Pride, which is just completely manic and emotional. And there's no rest, because up next is I'll Never Forget You. Again, brutal and fierce, early 80s hardcore. But again, it's really tight and disciplined too, with some amazing lead guitar. And last of these is The Biggest Lie, which is more melodic than the previous 3 songs, but no less intense. The tempo goes down to sort of more mid-pace for the song What's Going On. But that song is actually still quite noisy and fierce. And what's great is Grant adds some piano texture in the background. But then with Masochism World, we're back to hardcore punk, but now we've got elements of kind of like British post-punk in its dynamics. But then we're followed by the hypnotic and very melodic Standing by the Sea. And it's got great bass sounds, and you've got sounds of ocean waves. And And now we're getting less of the hardcore punk sound, going on to things like Somewhere. Somewhere is like a precursor to college rock again. It's dynamic and melodic, but it has a real edge to it. And of course, this is the part of the story where the main character falls in love. And then this is followed by a piano interlude called One Step at a Time. And now the next song is a high point of the album. And again, it's one of those tracks that really shows the direction that the band would take on future albums. Written and sung by Grant Hart, Pink Turns to Blue chronicles the protagonist's girlfriend overdosing on heroin, a substance that Hart would struggle with and eventually become addicted to. The song has an incredible riff, and it's accompanied by this like Buzzcock style pop melody, and the sound again foreshadows the whole alternative music boom of the early 1990s. This combination of melody and heaviness continues on The Newest Industry, this time with Bob Mould on vocals. Then there is another piano interlude entitled Monday Will Never Be the Same. Then the protagonist returns home, apologizes to his parents, and you know what? He might have imagined the whole thing. And the concept here is on the song Whatever. This song again has this beautiful combination of heavy guitars, melody, and it's just got so much passion to it. Next, there is the experimental and hypnotic Tooth Fairy and the Princess. There's this weird kind of echo effect, and the vocals are kind of repeating, saying, "Don't get up, don't give in," and other stuff like that. But then there's this really great rocking track sung by Hart called Turn on the News. Here, the protagonist of the story realizes that the world is dangerous out there. Amazing guitar playing, and there's occasionally with the riff, it almost verges on thrash metal. Not quite, but it has that chugging sound. But there's also great lead solos on it. Just fantastic stuff. And then the album closes with this 14-minute psychedelic jam called Reoccurring Dreams. It's a reprisal of the shorter track, Dreams Reoccurring, that focuses around this completely hypnotic and intense riff. The song will stretch out into all kinds of madness and then come back to that main riff again. And then the song ends and the album ends in a single feedback sound that Hart would compare to like a heartbeat flatlining, like you're at the end of a life. Now, the album was released on July 3rd, 1984. SST actually held back the release date because they wanted to release this double album by the Minutemen called Double Nickels on a Dime on the same date. So they'd have two double albums to release on the same date. Now, SST didn't have a lot of faith because they only pressed 3,500 copies, and those sold out very quickly. And while the band was touring, the album was not actually available. But eventually, by 1985, the album had sold more than 20,000 copies. Now, Hüsker Dü would release two more albums on SST, New Day Rising and Flip Your Wig, before they were actually signed to Warner Brothers, where they released two more albums, Candy Apple Grey and Warehouse, Songs and Stories. Now, with every album after Zen Arcade, the band would continue towards a more melodic, what we call college rock, alternative rock sound. Now, I like these albums, but for me, Zen Arcade is the peak of their musical vision. It combines a variety of musical approaches that went beyond the confines of hardcore punk, but what's great is there's still that hardcore punk on the album. And it kind of symbolizes what happened because it came out in 1984, and that was probably the final year of that initial wave of early 80s hardcore punk. But what I also enjoyed about the album is there's these noisy psychedelic jams that Hüsker Dü did not necessarily pursue in the same way on subsequent albums. But again, this album also has amazing songwriting on it, and it really effectively weaves a narrative for the listener to follow. Now, Zen Arcade is recognized as a masterpiece today. It was ranked number 4 on Spin Magazine's top alternative albums list. A lot of people who are now used to this very modern, high-produced, compressed sounds might not appreciate the lo-fi production of the album, but I believe that this is what gives the album its edge and authenticity. And again, you can hear the influence on the entire alternative rock genre of the early 1990s. Billy Joel Armstrong of Green Day acknowledged that Hüsker Dü was his favorite band when he was around 15 or 16, and Chris Novoselic said that Nirvana's musical style was nothing new. Hüsker Dü did it before us. All of the Hüsker Dü albums are fantastic and are worth checking out, but Zen Arcade shows the band at their peak creativity. It is, in my opinion, the greatest underground album of the 1980s. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. What do you think of Zen Arcade? Thank you.